Greetings and welcome back. Today in Is It Worth It? We're going to take a look at something I actually had some really high hopes for when it first came out. Today, we're going to take a look at the Garfield Show.
If you didn't know, I am a huge Garfield fan, having a large selection of the comics in many different languages. So when they announced a new CG animated Garfield Show, I was sort of psyched and afraid at the same time.
If you didn't know, back in the day, I despised anything CG animated since I felt it was a cheap substitute for 2D animation. But as time went on, I began to tolerate CG animation. I still love 2D animation above all else, but I can tolerate CG.
Anyway, as always, we're going to take a look at the first 5 episodes of the Garfield Show, and then base them on the 4 different categories: story, character, originality, and comedy. Since, if you know Garfield, then you know it is pure comedy. Well, without further ado, let's look at the stories.
A story about a fat cat doing funny cat stuff? Yeah, that is comedy. Now my biggest concern in this show is that Garfield is usually a comic strip consisting of 3 to 4 frames of pictures. How can you turn that into 10 minutes worth of story? Well, Garfield and Friends did a decent job at this if I recall correctly.
Anyway, the first episode, The Pasta Wars, an innocent enough episode. It is Garfield's birthday and John presents him a birthday lasagna, a piece of lasagna for each year Garfield is. They never mention gifts, but I don't think that is the point of the story. John Arbuckle, Garfield's owner, videotapes his cat eating the lasagna and uploads it to his computer, having more than 6 hours of Garfield eating the lasagna.
And he wonders why he's single.
Anyway, it seems that we moved to space to take a look at the Lasagnians and their plans to conquer Earth.
Of course!
So the very first episode of the Garfield Show is about aliens trying to invade the Earth. Okay. That is interesting.
It seems that they mistake regular lasagna for the brethren from a neighboring planet, and it is up to this lasagna piece to figure out what happened to them. Well, rather quickly he finds Garfield beats his ass and then reports back that the planet is safe to conquer. But it turns out that the lasagna people, after invading John's house, is being shown the lasagna eating cat video and they are horrified. So needless to say, they flee the planet and never return. At least, not in the first 5 episodes. Next episode, Mother Garfield, is mainly to introduce this Harry Cat guy who is a recurring character. And the main idea behind this episode is that Garfield gave up bird hunting, but when this bluebird came along, he couldn't resist. So he chases it around, ends up scaring it away, or so he believes. It's actually just stuck somewhere.
But the bluebird had eggs.
And then, conveniently enough, John and Odie is watching a documentary about bluebirds and their eggs. Feeling guilty about this and slightly concerned, Garfield decides to keep the eggs warm until the bluebird mother comes back. The eggs of course hatches, and Harry the cat chases both Garfield and the birds around until they accidentally freeze the mother. A job well done.
It's not a bad idea, but it's not really Garfield either.
Next episode is Orange and Black, the first Halloween episode of this new Garfield show. And before we even begin, if you expect something similar to Garfield's Halloween adventure Garfield in Disguise, you're going to be more than disappointed. This one is about Garfield eating all the candy, so John have to stock up on more. Meanwhile, Garfield wants to go trick-or-treating but needs the perfect costume.
So far so good.
And of course, it so happens that the news is broadcasting from the local zoo, which newly acquired a monster called Catzilla. And this Catzilla actually returns in a much later episode as a normal stray cat. Sad, but true, reusing assets such as character models is something the shows do a lot. But nevertheless, Garfield dresses up as this Catzilla and imagines different things in the mirror, to better motivate that monster attitude.
Come on, Garfield, let's do some aerobic exercises, then we'll eat nothing but lettuce for a month.
Yes, it's me, Nermal. I'm coming to live with you.
This is the character introduction to Nermal, the lovable kitty. Yeah.
Moving on, it so happens that Garfield is mistaken for the newly escaped Catzilla. And of course, as plots now usually go, Catzilla is now in John's house. They have a chase with and without Garfield, who removed the costume to escape. They manages to trick the Catzilla monster and it is recaptured, ending with a food-related joke.
A dozen lasagnas, and for dessert, and you might think this is odd, his favorite thing, peanut brittle.
In what zoo do they feed the animals lasagna? Or for that matter, peanut brittle?
Next episode is Freaky Monday, which starts out innocently enough with Odie wanting to play fetch. In the middle of the night.
Go fetch and sleep outside.
Now I have to admit that this is in fact Garfield, not on his very best, but still it is Garfield. And in fact, this entire scene could have been a comic strip.
Well, apparently a UFO crashes the side of the building.
Okay, 4 episodes in the show and already have we had 2 alien-based ones? Man, talk about reusing ideas. Save this for episode 20, then it would have been slightly better.
Anyway, it seems that Odie helps it out and the alien thanks him by changing his mind with Garfield.
So the good old switching bodies idea, which in fact can be funny if done right.
Sadly they don't. Garfield tries to get a hold of the situation and Odie eats lasagna. Already, the concept is dead. Well, it seems that Garfield tries to explain the situation to Arlene, who's understandably enough skeptical about the whole situation.
Which is okay to be, don't get me wrong, but this is a character introduction arc, and they only mention one date. And that is it.
Since the episode decides that it spent too much time on character development and jumps straight into the other one, which is Odie acting dumb and walks right into these 2 dogs who has it in for Garfield. So Garfield now have to protect his own body from both the killer dogs and Odie's stupidity. This is what should have started the whole switching body thing and they could have cut the whole Arlene part out. Well anyway, they manages to escape, Garfield chases normal and Odie is captured by the mailman. There's 5 characters already we have never seen before and you could only know them if you read the comics. It's bad introduction, people. Well, they get chased around the city and the alien ends up changing them back since apparently he thought it was a mistake.
No, really? Changing bodies with others is a bad idea? Who would have thought?
Anyway, this leads us into the last episode I saw called Bone Diggers, which starts out with Garfield eating pork chops, which honestly looks more like steaks to me. Never mind that, Odie gets a bone from Garfield and decides to gnaw on it, leading to the Mexican Chihuahua entering the scene with a slightly offending accent, I believe. Well, nevertheless, the Chihuahua tricks Odie and he is robbed of his bone. Garfield, who really couldn't care less, tells Odie that he can just dig up an old bone of his, which is exactly what Odie does.
But the twist being that this bone is in fact an ancient dinosaur bone.
Garfield, after realizing this, decides to talk to the local dino bone expert about some sort of reward for finding this bone. But wouldn't you know it, the commercial states that this particular museum destroys any household that is in the way. But Garfield, being the speed devil he usually never is, didn't hear that when he rushed through the door. He then arrives at the museum without any Ben Stiller, so be sad. Or happy about that, I guess.
Honestly, that whole series gave out some mixed reactions with people, right?
Anyway, Garfield is finally confronted with this old archaeologist and he's faced with the facts that we established some time before. Seriously, isn't there usually some sort of compensation when they evict people from their homes? Well, Garfield and Odie, Garfield thinks fast and puts all the bones they found on the Mexican Chihuahua's lawn, so this lady who's really used to digging on the ground doesn't think twice but is going to destroy the Chihuahua's home instead.
Because all the holes in John Arbuckle's residence doesn't give any clue whatsoever where the bones actually came from. Well, that's it, so on to characters.
Let's start off with Garfield. Garfield is sort of mixed in my opinion. Sometimes he's the mean and self-absorbed cat we all love and recognize. And at other times, he's a sweet, helpsome and just plain nice kitty who gives a helping hand.
Honestly, the best way to describe Garfield in this show is they actually hit him right on the nail, while being miles away.
Seriously, he gives Odie a single bone from his food and refuses to give him any more when Odie asks for another. But then he actually takes care of the bluebird's eggs and babies, which is unlike Garfield anyway. He eats up all the candy on Halloween, dresses up as a monster to get even more, and yet he helps Odie in various other occasions. Another thing that's probably not helping his character design is Garfield isn't that well written. It feels like half a Garfield.
Maybe this is due to the writers, or maybe they just can't establish 10 whole minutes of character development from Garfield, who usually is 3 to 4 frames.
Then we got Odie, the other more fleshed out character. He's Odie. There's no doubt about that. He's dumb, he's ignorant, he's not aware of any of his surroundings, especially not of how bad Garfield is treating him.
Which I must admit feels a lot like Odie and how he should feel. But then again, a stupid dog probably isn't the hardest thing to create.
You're an idiot.
Then we have John Arbuckle, who is Garfield's owner and friend. John isn't much in the first 5 episodes honestly, and he's more in here to make sure that Garfield doesn't do something unsuitable for children to watch. He is a cartoonist like he has been for some time. He's not the worst character, but sadly enough he doesn't do much in the 5 first episodes of the show, not enough for me to actually say he's well written.
The most fleshed out thing he has done is talk about his 6 hours footage of Garfield eating lasagna. Yeah, that is indeed sad.
Then we got the rest. There's Harry the cat, Nermal, Arlene, Vito, the Mexican Chihuahua, the 2 bully dogs, and many, many more. It's like they tried to incorporate so many extra characters that they ran out of time when they had to give them purpose and meaningful introduction arcs. It feels like they introduce a character hoping that you know exactly who they are so they don't have to spend 2 minutes establishing it.
And that is sad, really.
Let's talk a bit about SpongeBob Season 1. Some of the first episodes actually dedicated whole episodes to give us time to get to know these characters like Sandy, Patrick and Squidward. They gave them a lot of time to be developed so that later we would actually give a crap about them. The show is more like, have you read the comics? Good, here's the characters. But the only problem is that every character they introduce feels like they cater to the original audience, the long-time fans, people who knows and loves Garfield.
But the actual show feels like they cater to a new audience, someone who is really new to the show, someone who really haven't seen much of the Garfield universe before.
How original is the show? Well, let's take a look at the Garfield universe first, and in that regard, it is rather unique. With all of the aliens, the dinosaur bones and all that, even Godzilla seems to be a slightly new addition to the Garfield universe. The characters on the other hand are more or less pale imitations of their former selves. There is nothing new to make them stand out apart from underperforming of course. Nermal is just the annoying little cat, Arlene is just the girlfriend, Odie is just a stupid dog.
So in short, the ideas are sort of new and interesting, but the characters are just played too safely.
So how about the originality compared to other shows at the time? Nothing special really, CG is overused as always, nobody even dares to draw an actual cartoon anymore. Apart from flash animation, which should just be banned altogether. The concept, the whole idea, it's been done before and done better. There's really not much to make it stand out at all, apart from it being Garfield. So how well does this show fare in terms of comedy? The short answer, it really doesn't. The more in-depth answer, well, first of all, you can kind of feel the Garfield comedy trait in this, but it's really hard to find at times. Most of the time, a lot of jokes fall flat because they have to build them up too much.
Think about this, how Garfield is usually written in small, controlled environments, tailored for that specific short joke.
In this show, on the other hand, it's just too long. 10 minutes is a lot of time, especially for a character such as Garfield, which is usually surrounded by something that takes up a minute at most. And suddenly they have to make him work for 10 minutes straight. That can be difficult to pull off, which it shows. Seems like the writers are struggling to capture Garfield's essence, and that is simply because that making a character development that is usually based around a 1 minute joke and having to stretch that out to fill up 10 minutes just doesn't work.
Sure, the jokes in the show isn't running gags for the most part, which they actually did right, and those jokes can be sort of funny if you isolate them yourself.
Let's look at shows like the original Garfield and Friends. Sure, it wasn't a masterpiece, but I don't think anyone would argue if we said that Garfield as a whole isn't a masterwork. It's a short comedy about a fat, food-loving cat, and if you like that, fine, and if you don't, sure, go on ahead. The point is that the original Garfield and Friends show usually cut away from Garfield after 2 to 3 minutes, and then showed the Friends part for the same amount of time, then cut back to Garfield. The same can be said about Animaniacs. Usually the style was the same, 2, 3, maybe 5 minutes of Animaniacs, then 5 minutes of something else. It worked in their favor, they could mash a lot of funny stuff in and didn't have to drag out any of the jokes. Unless of course the joke was that they dragged it out a lot, and in that case they of course did it.
The Garfield Show, is it worth it? Well, if you are a hardcore Garfield fan who could even accept the live action movies, then sure, you'll be able to enjoy this. If not, well, maybe not the best, then it can be really tiresome at times. Even if you are a hardcore Garfield fan, there's no rewatchability in this. Watch it once at most, people. I'm the Angrynator, terminating bad movies for your entertainment.